Hello and welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Hello. Our guest this time is Dr. Jenifer Snook, who is a sociologist and a senior lecturer at Grinnell College here in the United States, and who has also authored the book American Heathens, the Politics of Identity in a Pagan Religious Movement. And we're going to talk with Jenifer about what heathens and the modern application of Nordic mythology into people's lives is all about. And so, yeah, welcome to the show, Jenifer.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Well, hopefully, yeah. I think there's definitely some questions I want to ask and get to, so I'm looking forward to it. I mean, formalities first, how are you? How are things? In whereabouts are you?
I am in Iowa, Grinnell, Iowa, so smack dab in the middle of some corn.
Is that all there is around?
That's literally, corn and prairie grass, soybeans, cows, lots of pigs.
A couple of rolling hills, too.
Oh, they're not very rolling. It's pretty flat here. Lots of prairie, lots of wind.
Yeah.
It's very cold right now, and we're underneath feet and feet and feet of snow that have accumulated, so it's pretty great.
We get snow for about we have maybe like 1 day of snow and then it's gone within 6 hours. It's fun. It's fun whilst it lasts.
Mathias, you have some snow too, right?
Yeah, we had a major blizzard. We had what was it? Minus 18 Fahrenheit, so that's about minus 28, 29 degrees, something like that. Celsius. Yeah, so it's been pretty chilly up here.
I can't even comprehend how cold that is.
Yeah, we had minus 30.
Yeah, that's just beyond my ability to understand.
They close the schools here because you'll get frostbite and within minutes.
Really?
Too many minutes of exposure, yeah. So we had a snow day yesterday.
I feel like snow days are a thing of the past now with COVID, especially over here. The schools have been closed for that long. I think everyone's adapted to Zoom teaching now.
Yep, that's what happens on snow days.
Yeah, snow days are gone. They're not a thing. It's just Zoom learning now.
Yeah.
It's that's unfortunate. It takes a little bit of the charm of snow.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So I mean, before we jump into like American heathenism in particular, I think we should kind of do a box ticking exercise of giving definition to some of the terms that we'll probably come across, because I know for me, you hear kind of heathen, pagan, ouster, and I don't know if there's a difference between them. I don't know what each one necessarily means in a traditional sense and in a modern sense. So I think for myself and for the listeners, if we could kind of get a rough basic understanding on each of them as we go forward, it's going to make it a little bit easier to kind of follow and understand.
Okay.
So let's start with heathen.
Okay. So heathens are sort of the specific kind of paganism under that umbrella of people who sort of look to inspiration to pre-Christian Northern European paganisms, like the stories and the folklore and the myths and legends about the gods and the heroes and the creatures up there. And that's sort of the foundation for their spiritual practice, their worldview. It's a whole sort of cultural system based on those myths and then of course all of the assumptions around what it meant to be heathen back then, and then how people adapt that to sort of a modern interpretation. So and I imagine a lot of your audience is heathen.
I imagine. Mathias, were you gonna?
Yeah, and of course this is sort of where we run into, I would say in modern times, contemporary times, we run into a bit of discrepancy between what is popularly otherwise understood when somebody uses the word heathen, right? There's that whole cultural context that has been established by Christianity being the dominant religion, at least in Europe and North America for some time now. So sometimes I think, at least for Scandinavia, what we see is also that people use the term heathen simply to denote that they're an atheist.
Yeah, that was one thing I kind of read as well, was some people use that, which seemed kind of wrong in my eyes. I guess in my basic understanding, I've kind of always seen it as a heathen is somebody who doesn't follow like the main three religions, kind of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Anyone outside of that would be heathen, but still believing in some sort of God, whereas an atheist would be somebody who believes in no God. So I always kind of wonder how people conflate the two or put the two together.
Yeah, I think that use is in the United States as well. When they talk about, when people say heathen, you'll hear them call people like a godless heathen. And that's usually in reference to just people who are not Christian specifically. And or people who are somehow immoral or sinful. And I think contemporary heathen pagans actually kind of get a kick out of the taking back of the term heathen, acknowledging that, yeah, I mean, they're not wrong. Like, we are not Christian, we are godless in that way of that God. But it is, it's kind of a reclaiming of the term, but it also has some historical relevance because of the way the Romans used to talk about Germanic tribes. I'm sure Matthias has more to say about that.
Oh, you're kicking the ball over in my...
I'm kicking the ball because, hey, as soon as we start getting into the Old Norse religion, that history stuff, that's your thing.
Okay, Matthias, give us the definition of what a heathen would have been in the Viking Age, then, I guess, or the times.
Well, I'm going to go all the way back to Roman times, right? Because what we're seeing in Roman times, in that period, in the 300s, where Christianity is slowly gaining traction, well, actually quickly at that point, gaining traction in the Roman Empire, taking over religious life and soon thereafter also what we could call, I guess, secular life in different ways. What we see is that people who still follow the old gods in the Roman Empire are referred to as paganus. And that means sort of something like hillbilly, basically. It's like it's those backwards people out there in the hills who still follow the old gods. That is that then sort of is the word that is used for basically any kind of polytheist, people who believe in multiple gods in the general Roman area, right? And remember that stretches far into what is today called the Middle East as well. And then we have these Germanic tribes up north on the other side of the Alps and the Rhine River in Germany. And they are in contact with the Romans. And the Romans, as they have converted to Christianity, are, of course, referring to these Germanic peoples as paganus, because they don't believe in just one god. They believe in multiple gods and all that stuff. And that's where we see some kind of translation into the Germanic languages, where heathen then emerges as a word that is being used. And I think the first literary evidence of the word is actually Wulfila, the Gothic missionary who writes the Gothic Bible. He uses the word, but it seems actually in that context to mean a person of the commons. So somebody who not a hillbilly like Paganus, but somebody who is associated with the community, And so there is something to be said for a original Germanic meaning of the word, because English speakers may note that heathen sounds pretty similar to heath. These areas that nowadays are sort of, in Northern Europe at least, like relatively desolate areas. But that word seems to have been used for the common grounds that you would use for grazing and other things in those small agrarian communities that were living in Northern Europe at the time. So there's something to be said for that word actually having something to do with community rather than, hillbilly in a Germanic sense. But of course, there's a translation that then happens, and heathen becomes the same as paganus in Latin. And that's how it's also used in the old Nordic languages in the Viking Age. Heathen means some kind of hillbilly. And when you start reading the saga literature, that's also where we find those stories where it's always, King Olaf is on some kind of journey far into the north, and then he happens upon a small island somewhere where there's this little backwards community that worships a horse penis and all that stuff. That's usually how it goes in the stories, right?
So, did heathen start out, I guess, as a derogatory term to be used negatively towards a group of people?
I think so. I think that's when there's an internal use in the Germanic peoples and their languages, which would also include the English. But then it soon becomes sort of like the Germanic translation of paganus. And then is used in a derogatory sense by the urban communities, at least.
Okay, so it seems that pagan and heathen is almost the same thing, at least originally. Is that still the case now? Is there a difference between heathen and pagan today? Because for me, they both seem the same, but I see you shaking your head, Jenifer.
Yeah, paganism is kind of the umbrella term, at least when scholars who study sort of pagan studies, is sort of this umbrella term of all the different kinds of pre-Christian or polytheistic, pantheistic faith systems, kind of under that umbrella, everywhere from neo-paganism, Wicca, native faith movements, to Druids, Celtic Reconstructionists, all of those, and heathens. But heathens are specific to sort of the Germanic region, right? That's when you talk about paganisms, you're talking about heathenry is Germanic neo-paganism, although some people bristle at the neo. It's new. It's new. I mean, the way we're doing it, right? Because it's based on these old things, but it's really a modern iteration of bits and pieces, right? And so, Celtic Reconstructionists would also be pagan, but they would just be also Celtic Reconstructionists, right? It's just heathens use the term heathen instead of Germanic pagan, although some of them do call themselves Germanic pagans instead, or Nordic pagans or whatever. But heathenry is kind of more of a broad term for those types of paganisms. Okay,
perfect. That makes sense. So heathen is a sect of paganism.
That's right. That's a way to put it, I guess.
Yeah, it's a way to put it. Both of us are kind of like, you could say that, but we probably wouldn't use the term sect.
Well, that's also because that term sort of has a negative connotation, right?
Yes,
like you think Waco or something like that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking it was a sector.
Well, yeah. So I mean, in the history of religion, I would say that you could use the word sect without it having a negative context. Also, to an extent, in other languages. That makes sense, but I think in American English, it's very sort of like this is a bunch of crazies living on a compound somewhere.
Oh, okay, okay. No, that's not.
Like we're the Jehovah's Witnesses of paganisms. It's not quite the same as it would be, when you're thinking about those sort of mainstream, faith currents. Like, it is a type of paganism.
Okay, it definitely wasn't intended.
No, it's fine. I just couldn't agree with it without the asterisk.
It's fine. No, that's fine. So, okay, we've kind of defined what heathen is and pagan. So, what's also true? Mathias, you raise your eyebrows.
Oh, that one's for me. Okay, yeah. So, also true is the in modern context Icelandic word for people who believe in and worship the Nordic gods. That's sort of a very distilled.
Just before you jump too far, did it exist? Is it a traditionally existing thing? Is also true something that existed in the Viking Age? A bit as called that.
Yeah, no, that's not what anything was called, and it's not even originally an Icelandic word. Actually, it's originally a Danish word.
Oh, the Danes coming out in you.
Well, so
can't help yourself.
No, it's not that. No, so in the 19th century, different scholars talking about what we today call the pre-Christian Scandinavian religions. We say plural religions instead of religion. That's a relatively new thing too. They back in the 19th century, they would talk about it as in Danish as Asalære or Asatro. So Asalære means the teachings of the Aesir, the primary group of gods in Nordic mythology, or Asatro means the belief in those gods. That's the word that they would use, and then that was adopted in Iceland as well as something that Icelandic scholars that at the time were primarily sort of like located in Denmark, because Iceland was part of the Danish kingdom at the time. They would be using that term as well, and that's how Ásatru then became a word in Icelandic, and then you have the 20th century rolling around, where people start actually, defining a modern belief or belief system. Or sometimes, especially in Iceland, maybe even just like an idea of some sort of like cultural adherence that has nothing to do with Christianity. And that's how Ásatru then becomes a word that is used in Iceland and in the rest of Scandinavia, and also pretty much at the same time when the early Scandinavian Ásatru communities and the Icelandic Ásatru Félagið, for instance, sort of formed and gained recognition. At that same time, we also see that word precipitating into North America and being used, and that would be in the 70s, 1970s. And so that's really how that word comes into play. And I think today, at least here in the United States, the meaning of Ásatru, as opposed to Norse pagan or heathen, is very distinct. Actually, I run into a lot of people who have a very sort of distinct idea of what Ásatru is, as opposed to some other ways of like venerating the Nordic gods. Whereas in Scandinavia, that's not a distinction that is being made. Like heathen, Ásatru, those kinds of things, they're all the same over there. But yeah, I don't know, what do you think of that, Jenifer?
Well, I'm thinking of, at least in my field work, a lot of heathens using, of course the Americans pronounce it Ásatru because that's phonetic, right? Think, how they identified it as Ásatru, or because that's kind of just what they knew it was called. And whether that was specific to Scandinavia or whether they were also using sources from Germany or from Britain or whatever, they didn't really they didn't articulate those distinctions very frequently. But some of them do. Like now that's changed, right? Just in the last few years, people are thinking of that as more specific to Scandinavia. But I think what we're getting at, Dan, is that there's also true if you think about the sort of the Scandinavian stuff, but then there's so many other different flavors of heathenry, right? Mm-hmm. There's like people who do like kind of Germanic based, like German sort of based heathenry, and they call it like continental. It's a different sort of a different flavor. And then people who are like, trying to figure out how to do how to really sort of revive or pay homage to at least the heathenry of their Norman ancestors, right? Or I mean, it can get very specific, but they're all heathen. Okay. Right.
And just to roll back to something that you asked, what was the term that, if there was a term that was used sort of in the Viking Age? The only thing that comes close is a couple of saga mentions from the 13th century, of course, of what they call fortsider, which basically means ancient custom. Mm-hmm. And this is contrasted in the sagas with Nysider, which means the new custom, which is Christianity. So there's that distinction that shows up. And that word fortsider, or those two words, ancient custom, is also being used by different groups in different places in modern times to denote something perhaps even more specifically Nordic sometimes, or maybe even less specifically Nordic. I've seen it been translated into Old English and Old Saxon and Old High German as well, as by certain groups here in the US who closely associate with these parts of Germany, for instance, and England. So that's also sort of like another way to add flavor to your particular brand of this heathenry.
Sounds like it's in true fashion complicated.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, you've seen Life of Brian, right?
I have, of course.
That we have what are the Judean Liberation Front sitting over there in the corner.
People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front.
Exactly. Yeah. They're all shouting splitter at each other, right? Uh-huh.
Okay. So he is one. Do you have to believe in a god to be heathen? Like, to be classed as heathen, would you have to believe that Odin, Thor, Frey physically existed somewhere, or could you be, I guess going back to how we said earlier, could you be atheist and maybe not even atheist, maybe more agnostic in and accepting that you don't know what's out there, but still be heathen and not necessarily believe in like the existence of Odin as a physical being?
Well, I'm going to say it's complicated, but yeah, you can. And there are a lot of there's even a Facebook group called Atheo-Pagans, which are basically atheist pagans. How does that work? And this is another one of the many hundreds of things that heathens fight about internally. Because a lot of them,
I bet there's so much fighting.
Oh yeah, just you name it. Again, it's the People's Front of Judea versus so it's some of them think, yes, you absolutely have to believe in the gods in order to be heathen, because what's the point of you if you don't? Why are you even here? Like, get off my lawn, right? And others are like, well, they're more like archetypes, right? Like, I want to kind of see the gods as sort of archetypes, standing in for these sort of lofty human, capacities, capabilities, this sort of ideal type, like love or compassion or war or whatever. They're just stand-ins. And then other people just kind of want to, like whatever God schmods, they really just kind of more want to do sort of the animism. Let's talk about nature, the spiritual essence of all the things, and kind of think about it as a cultural system. And some people are just really attracted to the aesthetic of heathenry, and also what they perceive as the kind of code of ethics, the way of being, and again, it's in every way subcultural, right? It's an identity, it's a collective identity, it's a community that people identify with and belong to, and then they just within that have quite a divergence of beliefs. And so this was actually a question that I had not too long ago, like how many heathens or pagans in general really are like atheists? And so that's when I launched that survey that I had going. It was before the pandemic. We were in London at the time. I don't remember even when that was. When was that? Was that just last year? Was it a year ago? I don't remember. But it's all blur. It's all a blur together. It's all a blur. But I had a survey that I put out, and that was one of the things is, what do you believe about the gods? Do you believe that they're real, embodied beings? Do you believe that they're archetypes? Do you believe that they're, just sort of ideas about sort of, things to aspire toward? I don't know. All these things. And I collected about 1,200 responses. So if at some point I actually get to that data, we'll actually have a more concrete picture of what people do believe, like how many atheist heathens were there, at least in that sample. 1,200 is not a bad sample.
No.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out if I would be classed as heathen or not. I mean, I think other people would probably class me as heathen, I guess, just on appearance and doing the podcast and what I do for a job. But I think my personal, I would say I'm probably agnostic in belief. Mm-hmm. I think when I was younger, I was very heavily, I'm a stubborn bastard. So I was very much atheist when I was young. I was like, no, there's nothing. And then as I grew older and got a little bit wiser, I think I then was just more of the, I don't know, and I'm happy not knowing. I don't need to know. It is what it is. But I also think that there are things you can learn from the mythology in a sense of like morals and lessons, and you can learn things from these figures like Odin and Thor that you can apply to your life. You don't have to necessarily believe in it as a god that existed or doesn't exist, or however. You can just, they're almost these created characters that do exist in, no matter how you look at it, they do exist in some capacity, whether it's a physical god or it's just a creation of man. These things do now exist somewhere, and whether it's in your, it's in your imagination. So they do you can apply these things that you learn from them without having to necessarily believe that they still exist. Right. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
It does. And it sounds just like the conversations that heathens have among themselves, right? Just thinking through, what are all the possible ways to be heathen? What are all the possible ways to believe? And really, it to a certain degree, it gets at the foundation of the definition of religion itself, like thinking through religion as something that doesn't require deity, even though a lot of people want to say that it does, but it does require some sense of the sacred, some sense of transcendence, and some sense of what I prefer to call, not instead of the supernatural, the supramundane, right? Where you're actually, this sort of something larger than you. And of course, a lot of heathens don't want to talk about the supernatural anyway, because they believe that, the supernatural, like, what's that? Like, we've got the natural world, which is awesome enough. And everything super to that would be what? Land spirits and all that. That's part of the natural world. So it's still, right, we're not supernatural, we're natural.
And Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add. I mean, this is also conversations that people had in pre-Christian Rome. Before Romans converted to Christianity and Greeks converted to Christianity, they were having these discussions over and over and making fun of each other for them. By the way,
as we do today.
Exactly.
Yes.
Nobody was talking so much shit on other pagans as pagans themselves back then.
Or today.
Or today.
Yes, that also hasn't changed. Yeah.
Yeah. But this is also, if you ask me, one of the sort of like the beauties of this is like a continual conversation about what it actually means to think about the world. Because that's essentially what it comes down to. If you ask me, you're thinking through ways of thinking about the world.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. I just think some people probably ruin it sometimes by getting a little too stuck in their way and saying, well, my way is the way that everyone else should do it, rather than it just being open and allowing people to kind of interpret it their own way. Like, they tend to be the people, I think, that come along and spoil it for everyone else. Oh, yeah.
I think you refer to somebody who's basically saying that it was blasphemous.
Well, and even if he only had one eye, they're going to argue about whether it was the right or the left.
Right?
You know? So.
I think humans just like to argue.
Well, it's all about identity. It's all about identity and about creating authenticity and feeling ownership over particular, boundaries of these identities, right? And so people feel they're very invested in them, and they want people off their lawn, and that's totally normal. Like, every subculture has infighting about who's more punk rock, like who's more authentic. So heathens are not special in that regard.
No, absolutely not. I think I've said this before, that I think the more you know, the less you care to kind of argue about it. So I think like a lot of the arguments about this stuff that you see, kind of the main place would be like the Facebook groups. It's people who know a little bit, and then they like to defend what they know to the death and kind of push that onto other people because that's what they know and they cling to it, and everyone else needs to know what I know. And I've noticed this change in myself. The more I've done the podcast with Mathias, the more I've learned, the more I've changed. Like, I've lost the need to kind of tell people this, and I'm just like, you know what, I know, so I don't really care if you know. But I think that does, like I say, I've noticed that. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I've noticed that in myself. This the more I know, the less I feel the need to kind of dictate to others how things should be.
Yeah, that's funny because it makes me think of all of the things that the heathens that I sort of studied and hung out with for all those years that made it into the book, that the things that they thought they knew about Old Norse religion, pre-Christian Old Norse religion, or the things they thought they knew about Norse mythology, that, and I'm a sociologist, so I wasn't really digging too deeply in what claims they were making. My whole job was to talk about what those claims meant in sort of a larger scope, right? And how those claims were connected to identity, community, etc. But then as I thought about those things, I recall, like, reading on Facebook conversations people would have, particularly with Mathias and other scholars who that's their bread and butter, right, is Old Norse religion. And they would ask him these questions that everybody that I had studied took for granted as true. And he would just piece apart, bit by bit, why that was bullshit, not true, never happened. And I just remember just this feeling like, oh my God, what would they all say if they knew this much? If they knew that everything that they hold sacred is based upon this illusion of continuity, this illusion of truth. Like, it's none of it. Like, I just had this epiphany of, like, we're making it all up. Like, I knew we were making it up, but I didn't know the extent to which we were making it up. And then at that point I was just like, well, you know,
Fuck.
why bother?
Well,
I was gonna say, I've just had a great idea for a T-shirt. We should just make like your face and something like "Breaking Heathen Hearts" since like 2010 or something. It's like a little tear rolling down someone's eye.
Well, and that would actually be a good reason for a lot of heathens to avoid Mathias at all costs, because they need a lot of these stories. Like that's they're sacred.
But I think they could just replace them with accurate stories.
Maybe, yeah.
But
I
also
think
think
that accurate story is just sort of like a puddle of nothingness.
Well, there is that. But I think you have to be willing to. You have to be comfortable in saying, we don't know certain things. Whereas I just think some people just aren't happy to do that. They want things in boxes and they want it to be perfect and neat when it's not.
Totally not.
I think one thing that's important to keep in mind here is that as somebody who's a scholar of this material, I was once just a dumbass who didn't know anything myself, right? I've come to this knowledge, wasn't born with it, so it's like I was also there at some point. I've been heathen most of my life myself, and I have believed things that nowadays make me cringe, and things, and so. I think that if you want to relate to a tradition of any kind, you should do your homework. If you ask me, like that's sort of the scourge of modern human beings in general at this point, because we have been through so much modernity at this point that like we have to actually like piece stuff together now ourselves.
Yeah. The thing is, though, is you read any of these forums where new heathens are going to, and they're saying, hey, I'm new to this. What should I read first? And the reading list is always, read the Poetic Edda. And read, there's sort of this, the kind of heathen Bible, if you will, is read the Poetic Edda, then maybe read some sagas, and then, especially the Havamal, like that's going to be your 10 commandments, and then you're all set. And then from that interpretation comes this limited understanding that you're getting at, right?
I would say 90+% don't even go and read those, though. I think they ask, "What should I read?" and then people get told, and they look at the book and go, can't really be bothered with that, and then just carry on in the forums and learn things as they go, and most of it is just wrong, so they kind of learn on the fly and never really get around to even reading any original sources, but they're just learning from other people they've never learned from the original sources, and it just snowballs into this big pile of just mess. Because I think people are lazy, though. They want to learn until it actually comes down to learning and doing the hard work, and then suddenly they don't want to learn. It's like, if you look in any rune group on Facebook or anywhere like that, it will be a group of people saying, I want to translate Dave into runes, or I want to make a bind rune for my dad and my son, or something like that, and can you do it for me? And people will be like, oh, well, try yourself, read this book. And it's like, but can you not just do it for me? And that's kind of like how people act now. They just don't want to do the legwork themselves.
I mean, that's true to an extent, but then on the other side of it, like, I've known lots of heathens who have taught themselves Old Norse so that they could read some of the original stuff. The problem, I think, happens when all these people are reading all this stuff, but they're not asking the scholars whose lifeblood it is to put that stuff in context and understand a more nuanced interpretation of it, and what stuff has been sort of thrown out and what stuff has been, like the cutting edge, right? Those conversations aren't, because they're inaccessible to a lot of people.
That's one reason why we started this.
And I would just want to add a couple of things here. As a scholar of this field, one of the interesting things.
Just not you because you're too busy.
No. So no. What I wanted to say is that as somebody who observes these groups of people out there who believe in this stuff, as well as being part of them myself and being a scholar and all that stuff. One of the interesting things that I've noted over the years is that modern heathens, also or whatever they call themselves, they're usually somewhere around 50 to 70 years behind in theoretical developments in the field of Old Norse studies and religious studies in general. Right, so this is the interesting thing, and it looks like it's actually changing now, where we're seeing the introduction. It's moving faster, and we're basically seeing the introduction of sort of more up to date material. But just go back 10, 20 years ago, and it was very obvious to me that I could see how what this person is saying right over here in the corner is basically a riff off of Sophus Buke and his theories on Old Norse mythology back in the late 19th century. That kind of stuff, like you can pinpoint it in time where people's ideas came from. Yeah, so I'm saying, yeah.
What do you think accounts for that shift that you say people are having now?
I think people are getting more educated. There are more people who come from the heathen groups and actually take educations at college level in different contexts. We're seeing a lot more of that.
Okay.
And I think
they bring that back to their communities.
Yes, and I think that's a positive development, to be honest, because at least it generates more thought on these subjects.
Well, and that's probably only gonna continue because of I imagine like there's probably a wave of new heathens coming right out of the history channels of the Vikings and the Valhalla video game and all these other sort of media exposures to this stuff that have renewed this new kind of passion for it.
Absolutely. I think you've got to be willing to learn though as well, because some people just get into it and then kind of put blinkers on and refuse. Like I've had, I remember one particular, there was a discussion about like the blood eagle, and people were, there was like this post about how something or other, and I was like, okay, like we've literally just done an episode with an expert on this. So I like posted the podcast and was like, look, just listen to this. You know, it probably didn't happen. It's pretty much medically impossible to do it. And then someone was like, no, I'm not listening to a podcast about it. I'm like, no, dude, like there's a doctor of fucking Nordic studies and a literal guy who's just fucking studied it. Like, you can't get better than this. He's like, no, not listening to it. Like, I what I know is right. And I'm like, it's just like, well, what do you do in that situation? You can't help people that don't want to at least try and learn something new. It's just, I've read this is what I know, it's true, that's it.
There's just so much information out there too, and I mean, I think we've all been I've been in the position of scholars who are studying heathenry in the academy, don't know who I am and haven't read my book. And it's like, I mean, says it right there, right? That word.
That's my name on that book.
That's so. So it's like it's like they didn't find it. They haven't heard of it. You know. So I do think that there's just too much out there for people to kind of know what to hone in on. Because certainly I'm not the only person who's done this. I mean, we've got this one here, right? Is that backwards? You guys see that backwards? The Norse Revival.
Norse Revival.
Yeah. So there's lots of scholarship out there. It's just what do you actually narrow down to?
Absolutely. So that's a good way to segue into your book. So tell us a little bit about it, I guess.
Okay. So it's based on sort of ethnographic fieldwork that I did, hanging out with American Heathens starting in around 2002. And I was in their living rooms, and I was babysitting their kids, and I was doing rituals with them in their yards, and I was going to sort of big gatherings. I went to gatherings in Minnesota and in Kansas and down in on the coast of Mississippi and in New Mexico and in Colorado, and so I was just all over the place, going to these gatherings and just talking to people and hanging out, and of course just asking an obnoxious amount of questions, and also scouring old publications and reading sort of old conversations that people had, and talking to people who'd been in the scene for decades, right? And so that's the sort of the basis for the research. And then from that, I kind of put together some themes of what seemed to be patterns of things that were important to people or that had broader implications. So there's a chapter in here on this idea about reconstructionism, that you can actually reconstruct a paganism like this from these old sources. So pretty much just rehashing this conversation we just had. But from a heathen perspective, this tension between people who are just kind of doing a heathen flavored neo-paganism with lots of other sort of trappings from Wicca and other things, versus the people who are trying to find some kind of purist heathen essence in their work. And so that chapter complicates that because, as we just discussed, it's nearly impossible, right? I have stuff in here on the impact of the internet, on how people get together and the forms that heathenry as a new religious movement, thinking about it using that conceptual framework, sort of ebbs and flows to take on these different sort of shapes and organizational forms. I talk about gender and women coming to heathenry and seeing it as a form of sort of empowerment, giving sort of voice and agency, with sort of the images of the Valkyries and the warrior women, and thinking about how they sacralize domesticity, like being in the home, like from something that you have to do as an obligation, because that's how we, the roles we give women, whether they want them or not, to thinking about that as more of control and ownership, right? So that's part of the rhetoric of a lot of heathen women talking about being a strong heathen woman is like, this home is mine, I have the keys. So it's a shift in language of thinking about doing stuff that you're going to do anyway, but thinking about it from a place of empowerment and control. There's a chapter in here that goes through the long...
Can I...
Yeah.
I was just to jump onto that. I think that must be... Whether it's true or not, like the Shield Maidens, Valkyries, like however accurate that is, that must be a really big factor into a lot of women getting into heathenism, because it is... You have these very powerful female figures, and this idea of women were equal in the Viking Age to men almost, and that must drive women into kind of being interested in it and then learning more, and that must be a huge factor in that, in kind of like pulling that females into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the women that I talked to, had that to say about how empowering it was, and how it gave them a sense of not just being a badass, but being in control of otherwise uncontrollable situations. I talk a lot in here about race and ethnicity, the concept of whiteness, and thinking of heathenry as... And Mathias is like, here we go. But just thinking about... No, because here we go, right? Now we're going to start talking about race and racism and whiteness and all that stuff. So it really complicates how white people are trying to revive a kind of ethnic identity, to looking at heathenry as kind of a continuity to these ancestors that they had from a place they've never been, but that they're somehow connected to as a way of kind of reformulating race in their minds instead of just being white. Right now you can be,
well, it's almost, you have to be, I think we spoke about this with Kai, that you're almost white Christian, and that's very much kind of the identity that most white people have, whether you're Christian or not. Nowadays, like the European kind of, especially in Europe, it's white Christian, and everything before that kind of got eradicated. So it's almost, like you say, finding that individuality of white culture that's not Christian,
right?
Because it does exist, and it did exist.
Yes,
but
and
it's also showing that and finding that without saying white people are the best, fuck everyone else.
Yeah.
So it's doing it in the right way,
which is really hard, especially in the American context, because we have this really complicated baggage of whiteness, of race, you know, where whiteness didn't exist, as you said, as it wasn't a pre-colonial identity. It's a product of colonialism. It's a product of sort of Christianity and slavery, constructing a whiteness against which they could measure blackness, right? That came out of that institution. And in this country, you can't, there is no such thing as, for example, a European race. European is not a race. And so when people want to be like, well, I have Northern European ancestors, well, cool. Like what kind? You know, because you're not just, you can't just say, I'm European, and then that's not a race, right? There's nothing to be proud of by just being white, if that's the conflation you're making. So I complicate it in that chapter because for a lot of people, they want that kind of ethnic identity, and this is in the literature on race and ethnicity, particularly among white folks. You know, they've talked for a while about how third generation immigrants often want to reclaim their ethnic identity that their parents didn't really have and their grandparents tried to get rid of to assimilate. But then come third generation, they want it back. And so they do the work to try and sort of reinvigorate that identity. And for heathens, that identity just takes kind of a uniquely heathen flavor. But it's hard to do that in this context where ethnicity is so often conflated with race, right? That those are two different categories of thing, where race is based on dynamics of power and oppression, and ethnicity is the bearer of culture. So you've got these two competing ideas that people just don't understand how to really work with. So that's some of what's in the book. I probably talked way more than you wanted about that, but that's what's in there now.
I think we should start with my first question, and then we'll work our way through, and I'm sure we'll probably circle back to the whole racing. Like American Heathen, how would you describe that as being different to maybe like European Heathen or just Heathen in general? Is it its own thing? Yeah, because it's in this place. And so every heathenry, wherever it happens, is going to take on the local flavor of the sort of the politics and the economy and just sort of the zeitgeist of where it is, right? And so for American heathens, well, they are Americans doing heathenry, so they're going to do it with a lot of these sort of American conundrums, right? They're doing it with this sense of sort of rampant individualism, right? In this system that really has this strong myth of meritocracy that's really beset a lot by these ideas of race and nation, and you know, it's kind of a set of unique problems, and they're maybe not unique, but they're American, and it creates a kind of American heathen. And also the fact that heathens who are heathen here, they're not over there. They're not in the place where heathenry comes from. And so there's a lot of things that they can't take for granted, including the ownership of a place. So there's lots of romanticizing and imagining and lots of pilgrimages to Iceland
lots of getting your DNA tests done to show that
seems to be a popular one.
And and again, it's a crisis of modernity. It's a crisis of sort of identity in the here and now. Just trying to figure out how to claim a slice of self, right? And so that's, I think, pretty unique. And also, there's not as much environmentalism in this country or among heathens. Probably more among sort of American Druids than anyone else, but not as much among American heathens as perhaps other kinds of heathens. And they tended to be, at least in a lot of my work, they were, of course, a lot of people on the right and some people on the left, but a lot of people in the middle who were like libertarian, right? Mm-hmm. Which is also a special kind of American thing.
I have no idea what libertarian is.
That's a thing, man. Just interject here.
Please do.
It's weirdly also a Danish thing. We have a libertarian party that was just part of government not so long ago. So it's also a thing in Europe.
I don't think it's a thing in England.
But do you do it the same? Do you do it with as many guns?
No, because that's a little more complicated in Europe in general. So not as many guns and not the same style of guns.
So what is it in a nutshell? Is that possible? Just so I can.
Yeah, explain libertarians, Matthias.
Oh shit. Libertarianism is a minimalist state kind of concept, right? So get rid of, at least in sort of its most idealized version, get rid of as many constraints as the government will put on you, and basically shave it down to the bare minimum. And we know this in European politics and in different kinds of ways, right? I mean, there are different political platforms that have similar ideas. And so that's sort of like a very broad, like flimsy way of describing it. In many contexts, I've actually seen libertarianism sort of like tipping towards various kinds of curious nationalisms and other. Things that it does not seem to have been in its incipiency, so to speak, like when it was first conceived of as political philosophy that has roots in ideas of the free market. You can throw guys like Adam Smith and probably Hobbes are also philosophers that they like, right? Into that mix. And nowadays you also find leftist libertarians. So that's sort of like a reinvention of anarcho-syndicalists and that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of funky things going on over there.
Pretty much, government, leave me alone. Just let us do what we want. I mean, bare minimum control and just organize shit, but otherwise don't tell me what to do. And a lot of that does, there are a lot of like, don't tell me what to do, but also don't tell people who they can marry, don't tell women what they can do with their bodies, but also don't take my guns. So there's some there's some complexity to it, right? Okay. And I think, Matthias can attest to this, because the question is how American heathens are different, by telling us how European heathens are different from American heathens, since he's been around both.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So one note about like the social libertarians, as they would be called, right? Those who are like don't tell women what to do with their bodies, don't tell people who to marry, and also don't take my guns. That's a lot of Colorado in general. That's sort of something that you see broadly over here. But going to the subject of like the differences between American and European heathens, well, there are many. I would say one of the main ones, using Iceland as an example, I would say, if you go to the Austurfélagið, some event they put on, and you hang out with people, I think you would find that their devotion to these gods, the Aesir, is all sort of like just non-existent compared to what you would find here in American communities. Because it's an entirely different sense of what it means to believe in gods, as we also touched upon earlier. A lot of people in the, especially the Icelandic, but also the other Scandinavian communities, are there more for the cultural flavor. And you would find a lot who definitely say, "Oh, I don't believe in gods. That doesn't make any sense to me." And similarly, you could also find groups like that in the rest of Europe, because there is a stronger secularization in European society in general compared to the United States of America. Even Christians are very different in Europe. And this is something I don't think Europeans and Americans really appreciate enough, that the particular brands of crazy religiosity that you see in the United States are very, very minimal in Europe, comparatively at least. Right. They might be changing a little bit, especially because we do see various kinds of missionaries from the United States, doing their work in Europe. So we do have. I think Denmark has a sort of like a growing group of faith healers and that kind of crap. So that's like attitude to religion is in and of itself a thing that is actually quite different depending on where you are, which continent you're on. Aside from that, what we also see, as I mentioned before, these like ways of distinguishing between, oh, I'm a Norse pagan, you're also true, you're a heathen, you're a this, you're a that, and so on. That's also less in Europe. You can find communities in Spain or Italy that identify as Scandinavian or Germanic, also true pagan, and largely, unless they are distinctly neo-Nazis, they tend to sort of fall in line with what you also find in Scandinavia, largely, if you ask me. So that in that sense, in Europe, there might actually be less difference between the groups, even though that they belong to different countries with very distinct different cultures. And over here, what you see is groups that have decided, well, we're this kind. We have this kind of rules, and we belong to this kind of imaginary past community. In one way or another. And I say imaginary and not necessarily in a derogatory sense, but in the sense of like, this is what we believe the past was about, basically. That's how it works, right? And you can even like, one of the, okay, so I'm from Jutland, right? That's where I was born. This like random peninsula that juts out from Germany, right? And like I've found groups like pagan or also true groups, whatever you want to call them, who identify as Jutlandic pagans, and I'm like, what the fuck is that? But this, so
you should know.
I guess so. So apparently, this is like a group of people who have traced their ancestry to that random ass peninsula from Northern Europe, right? And then they have fashioned, based off of course, Norse mythology to some extent, they fashioned a distinct Jutlantic flavor of that, whatever the hell that means. I mean, good for them, I guess. But as somebody from Jutland, I don't know. I don't understand.
So, Jenifer, what do you think the reason is that there seems to be such an interest in this kind of Norse heathenism, I guess, in America? Like you say, it's not technically the land where it came from,
right?
So what makes it such a big? Because it certainly seems to be such a big thing. I can only go on my personal experience, and kind of, we ship a lot of products out to America. It's other than the UK, America is by far our biggest market. So there is obviously a huge interest there. Is there kind of a single thing we can point to say this is why, or is it just a multitude of different things?
No, yeah. I mean, I think it's everything that we've discussed thus far, right? Thinking about some kind of ethnic identity, a sense of belonging, like creating kind of a connection to an imagined place and people, kind of imagining that you belong to a peoplehood, right? Also, there's probably something about the Viking aesthetic and this idea of the warrior ethos that appeals to the American spirit. That is,
that was
already a bit more, I don't want to say warlike, but, militant in that way than perhaps Europeans. And I do think that the aesthetic is appealing to a lot of people. Right? This idea of sort of, it's kind of like, a bit more, if you're going to be a pagan, like this is the badass way to do it, right? I mean, there's so much more. Cool. There's so much more, but that's just some of the things off the top of my head.
So one thing I was going to ask was, I think I've mentioned this before as well, kind of this idea. Not necessarily that the current culture is that it's negative to be a man, but this hyper masculinity is kind of frowned upon almost in current society. How do you think that plays a part into it, that kind of these Viking males were seen as quote unquote, very masculine males? So this kind of almost not in current times losing that, but some people, it can be seen as being negative. Do you think people go in that direction towards Vikings because of that? It's kind of another way to reclaim.
Right. There is a very special kind of American manhood that is sort of more, and scholars have documented this. I mean, Michael Kimmel wrote not too long ago a book called Guyland, and in his other work, and other scholars have talked about sort of the crisis of masculinity, because men over the last few decades, their wages have stagnated, right? They're no longer single earner households, right? They're kind of no longer they can't really take for granted totally that they're at sort of the king of the mountain anymore, because now you've got a bunch of women and people of color and others that are demanding respect, demanding equal access. So to a certain degree, men have had to cope with this sense of loss, even if it's an imagined sense of loss of sort of power and prestige over the last few decades. And heathenry, this sort of Viking manhood, provides men with this sense of masculinity that I think is healing for some men, but at the same time is easily abused, right? I do think
is that loss? Is it actually imagined I mean,
Well, not the economic stuff for sure. That's real.
right?
And yeah, and I mean, I think we can probably look at the stats and the configuration of the country and who's in power and who is in power in Fortune 500 companies, who's in power in the government, who's in power in banking, and all those things, to see that it's still overwhelmingly white men. Now, we see this as changing. But that change is what causes this backlash. Every time there's a frontlash of progressive social change, there's a backlash of people who feel as though something's being taken from them, right? And that manifests in a lot of ways. And it's not to say that all men are having those conscious feelings, that they're thinking this through and like, people are taking stuff from me. But it's this crisis of masculinity, writ large in the United States, at least, where heathenry is one avenue toward reclaiming a particular kind of manhood. Now that goes in a variety of ways, right? That can go in sort of the biker gang white supremacist way. And we do know that white supremacy, masculinity and misogyny and homophobia is all in bed together. Or it can go the way of just thinking of this as an expression of self, just like with the women, as we were discussing earlier, a sense of empowerment. But it's not necessarily connected with all the douchiness that comes with toxic masculinity, but can be and often is. And that's just part of the Americanness, the American thing, is this whole masculinity of Americanness, and that's a cultural thing over here.
Yeah. Well, what does that look like in the UK? Do you think, Dana? Like, are you guys pressed on your masculinity in the same way?
I don't think so. No.
Oh.
I don't know. I'm a hermit. I just live in my workshop and do the podcast. I think it's not necessary. I think the internet has a lot to do with it. Like, you see, it depends on, I guess we live in this world where it depends on what circles you're in and what Facebook decides it wants to show you. Mm-hmm. But I think it can sometimes look as if kind of like men are being attacked for, especially, I think, for the average person who isn't the CEO of a big company. They're just, John who works in the fucking mill. I don't know, I've gone back 20 years, 30 years. But it's just, he's in the mine. Let's go. But no, he's just the average Joe who clicks onto Facebook or looks on the news, and he sees this about men are doing this wrong, men are doing that wrong. Like, so-and-so's done this, and it's kind of, it's like men are being bashed, but like, it's...
Well, that's one way to see it. Or the guy in the mine could be like, yeah, man, dude, men, stop doing that. Stop being like that. And then,
I'm not being like, I'm certainly not saying like, whoa, men, we have it hard. But it's just, I just think that kind of average person who doesn't, he controls very little. He probably controls his own little domain that he lives in, and he could just sees all this negative stuff and probably takes it quite personally, when it's probably not really aimed at him. It's more aimed at the people who are abusing it, or the people at the top who I don't think it always necessarily comes down to even men or women. I think it just comes down to money is probably the main issue, and it's whoever's at the top has got the money, wants to keep hold of that, doesn't want to share it, and that's probably the most toxic thing. So yeah, that's kind of like my thought on it, is that just that average person or average man might feel like they're attacked when they're just kind of going about their everyday business, going to work, coming home.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to talk about and consider, because like across cultures, or between cultures, because as a Scandinavian man, I haven't felt particularly attacked or anything from the modern developments. I mean, the different Scandinavian countries have their own Me Too reckonings as well, and those kinds of things. And I mean, obviously there is a translation of certain concepts here and there that comes directly from the U.S. into these cultures, but they're being worked through on their own terms, I think. And they have very similar problems to an extent, but it always seems like it's more extreme in the United States than elsewhere. And this is something that's interesting too to consider, that the ideas of what is a man in that context, and what are men looking for when they go to heathen stuff. What I tend to find is like some rando talking about gender roles from the 1950s, and I'm like, that wasn't fucking gender roles in the Viking Age. Like, that's not how it works. So you then go back to wearing a floppy hat and a suit and a tie, like, because that's what that is, right? Like, that's not the Viking Age.
I think a lot of it's just hanging out with like-minded people, and I think some men might go to it because it's just that community feeling of just hanging out with other dudes that think like you, and no matter, like, I don't think there's anything wrong for just wanting to hang out with other guys. Equally, you can just hang out with anyone, but there is something. Like, I've been in sports teams all my life, and there is a different camaraderie around, like, being in a rugby team, and it's just like a bunch of guys are doing things. You're on kind of the field. You're willing to put your bodies on the line for each other. It's kind of a brotherhood, and I think that a lot of people search for that, because it is. When I stopped playing rugby, I inherently just missed that straight away. And it wasn't, I didn't miss getting beat up on the field. I just missed that closeness to a team of, like, other guys that think like me, and we're kind of in this environment. But I don't think that necessarily means that you dislike women in any way, because I like to hang out with women just as much as that. It's just it's different things. I think you can have a situation where you have a bunch of guys you hang out with, and then it's just another part of your life.
Yeah.
I feel like you raised your eyebrow at me, Jenifer, then.
I don't know how to respond to that. I'm trying to think of, like, okay, so we're circling back to where? One of the things perhaps that I could add to this is to put it in a broader context. When we're thinking about American heathenry in particular, we can trace it back to how it started as the Viking Brotherhood. Right? Stephen McNallen starting the Viking Brotherhood right around the time in the 1970s when the second wave feminism was really loud, right? And there were goddess spirituality movements and all of this new age stuff, and women were getting loud and demanding equal treatment. And so, like the other men's movements of that time, like the Promise Keepers or other men's rights movements, which were, again, a backlash to the frontlash of these women's rights, women's spirituality movements, the Viking Brotherhood popped up as a way for these dudes of like mind to get together and sort of experience and reclaim a sense of manhood on their own terms. Now, I'm not making any value statements about that. I'm saying that's what they wanted to do. They needed that in that social, political, economic moment. They made a group. They did the thing. But heathenry has, since then, just only recently started to chip away at that baggage of being hyper-masculine, masculine dominant, sort of in the aesthetic, in the way that heathens talk about heathenry as being sort of a warrior religion with warrior ethos, to a group that embraces sort of the perhaps more compassionate side of things, to more family focused, right? To include women in its leadership.
That's
right?
so weird because, one of the most masculine things in a heathen context is family.
Well,
like if you read the saga, it's always about a bunch of men who is focused on their family.
And certainly there are some flavors of conservative heathens that have reconstructed that old 1950s sort of women in the kitchen, don't cut your hair, wear a long skirt sort of, brand of family. Using heathenry then as sort of, again, this way to sacralize and justify those arrangements, as you could do with any faith system, really. So, I mean, again, it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated with assholes being assholes.
I think it just seems like there's different groups within heathens. Some of them are nice people. Some of them are not nice people who want to interpret it their way. And I don't think there's ever going to be. There's no ultimate place where everyone's just going to agree.
Sure.
Everyone's free to interpret it, and you're never going to get rid of these people who want to be twats.
No, but when they interpret heathenry in a way that dehumanizes others and puts them in imagined or actual way of harm, then those guys can fuck right off.
Oh,
right?
For sure.
They don't just get to be assholes without consequence, right? They have now interfered with other people's life chances and opportunities, right? By contributing to these larger systems that dehumanize people.
I think that goes for just anybody in general. It doesn't matter whether you're heathen or not. If you act that way, whether you're Christian or Muslim or anything, or atheist, if you act like that, then you can fuck right off. So I don't think it particularly matters that it's heathen. It's just there's just shitty people in the world.
Well, that's true, but heathens have kind of cornered the market on a particular kind of white supremacist assholery, right?
I very much agree with that. So that's really the problem that we're seeing with is sort of like this these faith movements, belief systems, whatever we want to call them. This is where there's a large group of them. This area basically attracts those types of people, especially because of the association with the whiteness of it all, right? And then you see the same thing with like
whiteness,
Slavic,
the masculinity. Yep.
Yes. And then adding to this, of course, it also very much looks like these groups, they tend to not really know what to do with them if they aren't aligned with the opinions that these assholes bring to the table. Like for a very big portion of those people who are part of those belief communities, they're like, well, fuck, what do we do now? We don't really know. And then it starts coming down to, these bullshit arguments about their free speech or there's like supposed to be room for everybody or something like that. And this is what those kinds of implosions have been seen again and again in established belief communities. Like there was I think it was in the early 90s in Sweden, there was one that a belief community that imploded because of that. My home country, Denmark, has had its own problems with that. And of course, there are plenty of organizations here in the US that have experienced these things. You can go to the UK and find similar things. So it's a real problem. And it's also a problem that's really hard to handle in different ways, if you ask me. But yeah,
that's the thing. How do you handle it? As sad as it is to say, it's almost an impossible task, because it's not as if we're dealing with a club where you can say, okay, you're a twat, give us back your club card, you can't come in anymore, we don't want you here. It's this open ideology that anybody can identify with. So even if 95% of people say, fuck off, we don't want you here. That 5%, you can't physically stop them or force them from identifying with it. So, like, how do you counteract against it other than just telling them that they've been really shitty?
Well, one of the things that heathens and heathen scholars have been working on for a few years now, myself and Mathias and a bunch of others, is thinking through ways that heathenry can be deliberately and proactively anti-racist, right? And how we can reclaim the narrative of heathenry that's been co-opted by these assholes who use it for, to espouse ideas about white supremacy and Aryan, supremacy, and how we can, make heathenry anti-racist, not just like we don't like racists, but like do that proactive sort of more activist work of reformulating it in that way. And it's been hard. I mean, it's not impossible. It's work, and of course we all have jobs. And there's people doing this work. It's probably not happening as fast as we'd all like to see it happen, but there's groups of scholars who who were even disconnected from the groups that were in Mathias that are also meeting and having conferences and thinking through a way to rid paganism of white supremacy in general, because it's heathenry, it's got a special corner, right? But it's also in other kinds of paganisms, right?
Unfortunately, I don't think the people who act like that are listening to things like this podcast or Mathias or yourself.
No.
I think they are the kind of people who latch onto the first information they find that fits them and then close their ears to everything else and just run with it. So it's how do you tackle that and get to those people and re-educate them. And obviously for us, we've just been trying to like educate everyone else so then they can counteract these people with true information.
This is where I would say that companies like yours, Daniel, are a piece of that puzzle, right? Because you're a Viking branded company that uses non-white models. Already there, you're part of changing the visual aspects of what it means to be Viking associated.
And but I can't name another one. That's the other problem, is that I think there's too many people, whether it's companies, bands, or whatever else, who are scared of upsetting their bottom line because they understand that there is a portion of people who will buy their products, listen to their music, that are racist, and they almost just turned a blind eye to it because they know that the money is going to come from that area, so they don't want to necessarily do what we do because it can have an effect on your money you make, and unfortunately money is just the fucking root of all evil. So it's convincing more people, because like when who did we have on? I can't remember who I mentioned it to, whether it was, I think it might have been Nordvig from Farrand, and it's like saying, if he or Wardruna or Heilung or any of these groups like actively spoke out against racism, I imagine that the people in the background who actually run the show, who pay them, and the producers are suddenly going to go, oh, hang on a minute, our fucking revenue is going to drop if you do that. And it's so sad to say and to even speak about, but it's probably the truth. It's probably what happens.
But there's the rest of us who could do public-facing scholarship, who could do more public appearances. I mean, like you said, we're preaching to the choir, right? Like the people who really need to hear it aren't going to consume it. But it's also a way to get out there to people who will hear it, who maybe don't know anything about heathenry, and still want to consume stuff like this because they're not deliberately ignoring it, who then can be educated about what it is and isn't, so that the voices of those few extremists, when they hear it, they'll know that they don't stand for us, and then it will further marginalize them. And so I think that work can be done. This podcast is a piece of that. I did an interview with a local NPR station not too long ago, a couple weeks ago. That's a piece of it. So, I think that work can be done.
Yeah. No, I've also I was interviewed by Arizona's NPR station that was asking me about that jackass with the horns.
Yeah. I got asked about that too.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, before we wrap up, I'm just gonna go through a few questions. So yeah, the first one is, how much do you think that I'm gonna try and I'm terrible at reading. I'm just gonna. Okay, so it's how much do you think people are stuck in the idea of like monotheism, and kind of like this idea that most people, I guess, are brought up with, especially in Christian countries, of there being one God, and that's kind of like the right way to think about religion. I guess even myself, I was I was atheist, but I went to Sunday school with my grandma when I was a kid, so that kind of idea of a religion, that it was just one God, was embedded in me. So how much do you think that has like an effect, or how many people think about it?
I'm sure it has a huge impact just on the way that people are socialized to experience and think of religion. But one thing that I noticed in American heathenry in particular is this practice of people taking patron gods, basically picking one god that's their favorite god and worshiping that god over all the other gods, and really identifying with that god and developing a special relationship with that god. To me, is a bit of a reflection of that, but that's not to say that that's ahistorical either, right? Like, didn't people back in the day have their favorites? Like, they picked favorites, right? So, but I do think that the way they do it now, the way they do it now, I think, is a little bit more of a monotheism thing.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, I would also say that the emphasis on Odin as an all-father, particularly in American heathen contexts, is also, I think, an expression of that sort of like enculturation into like a monotheistic idea of what religion is. I think that's very widespread, and I think it's simply because people are like used to thinking about a god as a father and such, right?
Yeah, it's comforting, it's comfortable, right? It's something they're used to, and yeah.
For sure. And he's quite grandfatherly, isn't he? Let's be honest. It is very comforting.
Grandfather Odin.
With both eyes. Okay, the next one is, do you think the popularity of bands like Wardruna and Heilung have had an influence on people getting into heathenism? They say that they are an atheist, but they do have some sort of experience of a spiritual journey when a Wardruna or Heilung show. Just to add to that, I think with like the Farrand episode last week was a good example for myself, listening to his album. I'm agnostic, but I did have some sort of connection to his music, and definitely felt like an emotional feeling from that I couldn't explain, but it definitely kind of happened.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to carry the monotheism comparison, I think that those bands are, for many contemporary heathens, a form of spiritual music, right? It's transcendent and deeply, deeply meaningful. Way beyond just like, hey, I like this music, it sounds cool. It is religiously significant. And to people who find that first, and then do they find their way to heathenry through it? I imagine that happens for sure, especially with Wardruna. I mean, you can't really ignore the heathenry in their music. So I think that probably, I don't have the data yet. Maybe I do. I don't know. We should see. It might be in there. But, to really know, like, whether people found the music first and then came to heathenry through that, I imagine it happens, especially as that music becomes more popular.
Okay, so one question, Jen, was for you. Was what impact did you hope that American Heathen would have on the community when you were writing it? And I guess to add on to that, do you think it achieved that, or you got what you were
I'm not sure I really published this with many hopes. I guess I was, if I was hoping anything, it was that it would bring heathenry more legitimacy as an actual faith system that was not just sort of, reenactment weirdos, like, Muggles probably see it as. I thought, like, this is, because it's it's a scholarly work, that it'll bring attention, that's respectful. Heathens, I think the initial reception by at least the people who or take part in the work, who were in the work, who I interviewed for the work, was to be like, yay, it's out. And then did they read it? Who has time? Right? Mm-hmm. Who has time for that?
I think every book should be an audiobook now.
Yeah.
I think that's such. I honestly think that's such a big thing.
Yeah.
Because I know for me, like, I work in my little workshop, and I just love to put audiobooks in. That was the first thing when I asked Mathias where I could read your book. I just went on Audible to see if it was there, because that's just easier for me. And I think that maybe is a case for a lot of people that like to listen to them when they're driving, and that's maybe a testament to like why podcasts go so well.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how easy it is to get a book into audio.
I don't know if publishers, I don't know, would they contact me and say, do you want to read this? And I haven't heard. I don't know how that happens. That side of the industry is a secret to me.
I have no idea.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, Temple University Press has not yet suggested it, so. Yeah, and probably would pick a different voice actor. Thank goodness. So it came out, and a lot of people didn't read it, didn't have time. And every time somebody says, I've read your book and I really liked it, like, I'm kind of shocked. Like, it takes me aback that, oh, you're one of the few. Thank you for contributing to my $25 in royalties this year. And then what happened immediately as well was a bunch of these right-wing sort of men's rights guys reading it, getting to the gender chapter, becoming livid, posting mean reviews, flooding Amazon with mean reviews. And of course, none of the people who liked it were reading it or would be nice were writing reviews. They had other things to do. And so that was happening. And then, people in message boards were just, in general, being mean. Being really mean. And then I got stalked by a guy who kept making different profiles to harass me via Facebook. And every time I would block it, he'd pop up again. And when you teach in a university, like, you're a public figure, people know where you work. Like, your office has office hours posted. Like, I'm very easy to kill, So that kind of made me basically just leave all the Facebook groups and just kind of turtle for a while.
That's shit.
And only now am I kind of resurfacing because a bunch of people keep asking me to do stuff.
People suck. Don't let people like that kind of... I know it's hard not to, but you got to try and kind of get rid of those people and shut them out of your mind. I mean, especially with reviews, it's only, you tend to find it's always. I
didn't even read them. I don't.
No, I wouldn't even bother because it's always
do that.
It's only shitty people.
No,
it's only shitty people that ever take the time, and it's really unfortunate because it's usually only the bad ones that people can be asked to go and write. It's there's probably hundreds more people who really liked it, but they just read it, like it, tell a few people about it, put it down, and that's it. They don't go online and review it. So anybody listening,
I only knew about the reviews because some of my friends were indignant on my, and they would tell me like, oh, these people are writing these reviews. And I was like, yeah, don't tell me. I don't want to know. I don't want to know any of that. Don't want to know.
Okay, last one. What do the rituals consist of? And I imagine it's different for everybody. So how may it vary? I assume that kind of as a general thing. They didn't really give too much context.
Well, in American heathenry, there are two main kinds of rituals. There's bloats and symbols. And bloats are just sort of a general ritual to honor a deity or a season or something like that. And, you know, people circle around and they say words and there's mead and usually everybody in the circle gets to share, you know, their words of offering or honoring of a deity. There's often fire and a drinking horn that goes around and lots of shouting of hail. And then, you know, usually like some feasting and hanging out. And the Sumbul is similar, except involves even more drinking during the ritual. And it involves 3 rounds. One round is to basically ancestors and heroes. One round is to gods or land spirits. And then one is oaths, boasts, or toasts. And then usually the last round is sort of a drunken revelry of singing and just telling everybody how much you love them and how happy you are to see them. And it's when it involves a lot of people, it can go hours. And
I imagine everybody gets a little bit more drunk as well.
And if they're really formal events, people dress more nicely and they gift each other. There's some public gifting that sometimes happens. At least that's how it's happened in all the places in the States that I've gone to. And the rituals are kind of loosely based on, I mean, let's be honest, McNallen took Wiccan rituals and he reformulated them because that was the basis for what he had. And he tried to heathenize them. And then that was what heathens had to start. They have since adapted this main ritual, and just kind of, played with it and made it their own in a lot of creative ways around the country, you know, depending on region. Some of them don't use the horn or like they don't use the hammer to call like the quarters or whatever. That's very Wiccan. Instead, they've decided that they're going to just carry fire around because apparently that was in a book somewhere and said that's what they did back then. And so it's really a fantastic way to build community. I think it's another sort of community and camaraderie in sort of that practice of engaging with the sacred. And it can be a lot of fun and it can be really intense. Like some of my most intense experiences have been in heathen ritual.
I agree.
Awesome.
Yeah, like that. It can be very intense. It could also be some sort of like lame drunken therapy in the woods. Like it can go in many different ways. There's also a place for that.
Awesome. Let's wrap this one up.
Yeah,
it's been fun.
Yeah,
it's been fun.
Yeah,
it's a little chaotic at the beginning. We are without a producer this time, so we've had to revert back to the old ways. So it might be a little haphazard. But we managed. We got there in the end.
I've basically not really seen you, either of you, during this episode because Riverside constantly takes away the video.
Aww.
Yeah, it's my connection is bad according to Riverside at least. So
I think hopefully we can put something together.
Yeah. Yeah. So, thank you so much for joining us, Jenifer.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right. Do you want to just let people know where they can find you? I don't know if you're back on social media, if you have a public one, or just the book in general. If you want to.
Yeah, I mean the book. The book is it's on Amazon. I mean, and of course wherever else people buy their books, I'm sure their local bookstore could order it. And I don't really have a robust social media presence.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for reasons, but...
What's the full book title?
It is called American Heathens, The Politics of Identity in a Pagan Religious Movement, published by Temple University Press.
There we go. Go and read it. Matthias, where can everyone find you?
Well, you can always find me by my name, Mathias Nordvig, on Instagram. Go shout slurs at me after this episode if you feel like. Well, please don't. I'm sick of that. Oh, actually, most people are nice on my Instagram. It's mostly Horns of Odin that gets all the shit, right?
Sometimes.
Yeah, so you can find me there, and you should also always, of course, go find the Nordic Mythology podcast on Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can also find Nordic Mythology podcast on Instagram. Obviously, you've got Horns of Odin on there. My personal one is Daniel_Farrand1. Our website, you can pick up some t-shirts and merch. They're going to be with me soon, so they'll be getting posted out shortly. That's just NordicMythologyPodcast.com. The Patreon, if you want to help us get to 100 patrons, we're going to start our new Viking watch-along show where we're going to discuss the program episode by episode, talk about what's real, what's not real, what we like, what we don't like. So that should be fun. I think we're at 80 at the minute, so it's got 20 more to go, and then we'll be doing that. I think that's about it. Oh, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're trying to grow that, so that's just Nordic Mythology Podcast on YouTube. Pop on there, watch some videos, we've got some highlight videos. Hit subscribe and you'll get a notification every time we post a video. I think that's it. I think I've got them all now.
Yeah, I think
so.
That's it.
Jenifer, thank you very much. This was fun.
Sure thing. Thanks, guys.